Hello everyone and welcome to Sinful Gaming. I hope you're all doing well, I hope you're all staying safe, and most of all, I hope you're all fighting that war against Grey. Today we've got a fun little video for you all called Tips for Writing an Army List. This video is aimed at helping players, especially newer players to the game, understand how to write an army list for games of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. Now this video is not aimed to be a competitive video talk in any way. In fact, it's more aimed at just your casual games, and this can help, hopefully with some of these tips in here in your casual games, enable your army to do more on the table and play the game a little bit better. Warhammer Age of Sigmar is very rules light in its core rules mechanics. Now, this doesn't mean though that there aren't things and the game cannot get complicated in ways you don't actually first see. Because it's so rules light, there's a lot of things that are left out of the rules that maybe you need to consider doing when building in an army list, and these are the things that we're going to go into in depth and talk a little bit about all these sort of things, and hopefully help you avoid falling into the pit traps that some new players will fall into just by not understanding how the game actually works mechanically on the table and the difference between rules written down and rules when played on the table. So let's get cracking into this, and this is going to be a video entitled Tips for Writing an Army List. So the first thing we should chat about before we get into anything else is actually some great ways to build an army and things you can use to help build you an army. So for me, there's a bunch of fantastic apps that you can use for building an army, and all of them provide a great service, some of them at a cost and some not. So to start off with, we've got the Warhammer Age of Sigmar app, which you can see a logo for on the right of the screen here that I've got up. Inside this, you can have a paid subscription service for a minimal fee called Azir. Now, Azir is one of the quickest ways you can build an army list. It's really simple and looks nice and clean. It does have some issues with potential updates, maybe taking a bit too long to update sometimes, but using it, I use it almost daily and I do pay for it. Even though it's not always updated the greatest, it is a fantastic little app that you can use. On the other side, on the left, you've got Battlescribe, which is a community-driven app, very similar to Azir in how you can build your army list and write. It's an app you can download on your phone, on your iPad, whatever device you have, and use it on the computer as well, much the same as other things. And it does all the same things. You can build your army list. It doesn't make them quite as clean, and it's not quite as well updated for Warhammer Age of Sigmar or as well suited when it puts out army lists. But the third choice for me is the icon I've got in the middle, and personally my favourite way to write up army lists for Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and that is using War Scroll Builder. War Scroll Builder is a web app, so it is an app on the Warhammer community website, and you pick stuff up. It's the most frequently updated. It prints out your army list on a single page, and it has a bunch of other fantastic things that it can do. It, for me, is the best out of all three, and of course, the best thing about it is it's free. So the first thing to do is check your requirements and restrictions for the size game you are playing. In open and narrative play, there are no requirements or restrictions in how you do your army list. However, in match play there generally are, and there's a set amount of units of particular types and particular categories that you must take, or have a maximum on some units of types or categories, etc. It's important that you check these, as these will be the fundamental things you're trying to include in your army first, and make sure you've got these requirements filled out, and then you can go on from your army. When doing this, generally in match play games, you will have generally a hero or more required in your force, and you'll have at least 2 battle line and 1,000 points, 3 at 2,000 and 4 at 2,500 required. There's a few things you want to do when you consider these units that are required, and you generally have either units that you want to take or units that are referred to as tax. When people are referring to tax units, they're referring to units that you're only taking because they fill out battle line. Generally, tax units aren't necessarily a bad thing. It's allowing you access to other things in the book, and so tax units are generally something really cheap that you don't necessarily want to take, but you're taking them because they're the cheapest option available to you to fill out battle line requirements in an army, in order so you can spend points elsewhere instead of spending it on more expensive battle line that you don't really want. Heroes, generally there'll always be heroes that you want, and I don't know a single army in Warhammer Age of Sigmar that actually doesn't want to have a hero in it, so it's always important with your heroes to get ones you're going to use and get the most out of. The other thing to make sure you've checked your requirements and restrictions for when building an army for Warhammer Age of Sigmar is if you've included any War Scroll battalions in your army, and we'll get more onto these later, is just making sure you filled the requirements for the battalion. War Scroll battalions have required units that need to be taken in them, and they also have maximum sizes of that. Some are more restrictive than others, but they all have these units that must be included in them to make them work and give you the benefit of taking them. So it's always worth, once you've got your basic troops out the way, your battle line and your hero out the way for your army to be built upon the foundations of, to make sure you've also got everything included in your battalion that you need to have there. It's worth remembering too that battalions that include your battle line and hero can be a boon because you're doing both these jobs at once, so that is definitely something to keep an eye out and see if battalions are worth taking if they're going to fill out your battle line and your hero as well. Next, you've got to consider the battle plans that you'll be playing in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. Battle plans are the core foundation of everything we do on the table in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. They're what's determining the objectives in play and what can hold those objectives. This is the most important thing to consider, what can hold objectives. There are particular battle plans out there that only allow heroes to control them, or heroes with artifacts. Some allow battle line units and monsters or behemoths to score extra points if they're holding the objectives, and some also give you extra benefits or don't allow your opponent to burn certain objectives if you've got types of troops on them that are appropriate. All of this is worth considering, and generally when you're playing a normal game just against your friend, it's not anything to really think about too much. But it's definitely worth considering if you're going to an event for Warhammer Age of Sigmar. Definitely read the event's Players Pack. The Players Pack will generally tell you what battle plans are going to be used in the event, and so it's worth looking at those battle plans, considering what you need to be able to do in those battle plans. Whether there's a lot of objectives in place, you're going to need lots of units and be able to move across the table, or if you're needing, say, a battle plan that requires heroes to be on the objective score, you're going to need heroes and probably survivable heroes on the objectives there. These are just things to consider when you're going to play in particular battle plans. So now that we've considered all the things that are required to be in our army, the next thing we need to consider is drops. Now, you may have heard this term thrown around a bit by people talking about things like 1 drop, 2 drop, and just drops in general. Now, what they're talking about is the amount of things you've got to put down on the table, the amount of units you've got to put down on the table. When you start a game of Age of Sigmar, you go in a you go, I go manner of deploying units on the table. Drops are what these are. Every time I put a unit on the table, it is a drop. Every time you put a unit on the table, it is a drop. Now, we take turns putting drops down onto the table, and the player who gets to finish putting down all their drops first gets to choose who has the first turn in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. Now, this is where drops become interesting, and where battalions once again start rearing their head. Battalions in Warhammer Age of Sigmar count as a single drop, though they can also be used to spread out your drops as well. You can actually put a battalion in as many drops as you want. That obviously has that many units. So if there's 8 units in a battalion, you can say have it as 8 drops, 1 drop, 3 drops, 4 drops, in any combination, so long as all the 8 units are put on the table at the end of the game and all dropped. Now, drops are important mostly because, once again, you're just going to get to choose who has that first turn. So this is going to affect how we plan out the rest of our army. If you are low drops, say 1 to 3 in general for Warhammer Age of Sigmar, you have a very good chance of being the one to choose who goes first. Especially if you're 1 or 2, you're in that top 5 to 10% most likely of armies that are going to get to go first most of the time. If you're starting to go 4 or more, your drops become an issue, and you are going to need to make contingencies in your planning of building your army to counteract the fact that you're likely not going to get the choice of who goes first. And so you're going to need to plan for things either being given the first turn or potentially not allowing your opponent to alpha strike you and really harm your forces. So we'll get into some tips now on how to sort of plan out our army more so, but drops is definitely something to first of all consider, and you'll hear this thrown around a lot in the video. If you're low drops or if you're high drops, this becomes more important to think about, etc. So let's get kicking on to some more thoughts. So the first thing to consider next about your army is, now you've got all these different units, you've got your battalions and all that sort of filled out, your baseline requirements is unit sizes. Now, a lot of things I see new players getting into the game get struck with is they generally try and build their units up to the biggest size, and this leaves you with very few units on the table. It's important in Warhammer Age of Sigmar to have a decent amount of units on the table that enable you to control the board when playing the game, or at least have your army spread across or have a bunch together really well. There's uses for all these units, but it's important that you have different sized units and not get lulled into a trap that is having all these massive units that really become clumsy and don't actually perform all that well on the table. There's not that much difference if you have a 1-inch reach weapon with a unit of 10 and a unit of 20 if you're on, say, 32mm bases, where only the front rank is ever getting to attack. While, say, a unit that has a 2-inch reach weapon and is on a 25mm base is going to want to have very large units because they're going to get lots of attacks. In both cases, though, it is important that you have different size units in either army using these particular base sizes and ranged weapons, because this allows you to do different things with those units and have them perform different roles within your force. Even though the units may actually be the same models and the same rules, you can have them just by having different unit sizes perform different roles in your force. So now that we've talked about unit sizes, we're going to talk a little bit about the roles that these things can perform. Especially your smaller units, or potentially even your larger units, they're going to be able to perform a bunch of different roles in your army. Now, to start off with, we're going to talk about screens, chaff, and objective holders in that order. Screens are units that you actually put out in front of the rest of your force, and they enable you to protect your troops. Sometimes these are just throwaway units, or sometimes these can actually be really hard defensive units that your opponent has to actually struggle to remove, that hold the line, allowing your troops to actually attack over the top of. There's a lot of different tricks you can play around with this, but it's important that you have screens, especially if you're a higher drop army. You really want to have screens in your army that can stop your opponent hitting you and stopping alpha strikes, most importantly, more than anything. Chaff is similar to screens. Chaff refers to units that are just throwaway and you don't really care if they die. In fact, chaff can be screens as well. You can have chaff screens, which is generally units that are just literally put out in front of your troops to die and receive the charge, allowing you to play the counter-attacking game. However, anything at the right point in time can be chaff. It is just something thrown out there that has no meaning other than stop your opponent either getting to you, getting to somewhere on the table, or doing something you don't want them to do. It could even be just getting in range in an objective or anything like that. The chaff are literally there to die, and they are there to just consume your opponent's time in the game and stop them doing what they want to do. Remembering, anything can be chaff. Even your greater demon of Khorne, a bloodthirster, can be chaff if he stops your opponent doing something. And the last one here is objective holders, and this is probably the most interesting thing to talk about because objective holders have an important role. Obviously, they hold your objectives, and so you need these units to either have lots of bodies, be really tough, and you also potentially, if they're going to be holding objectives further up the table, need them to be able to actually move at a decent distance or in some way. Objective holders also, for the most part, lots of units that some people maybe chuck on objectives don't actually affect the game other than scoring points. And so sometimes it's worth considering, are your objective holders maybe not doing anything other than scoring points, which isn't a bad thing because, once again, Age of Sigmar is scored entirely on points, and so that's all that matters at the end of the day. But maybe if they had a ranged weapon as well, they might actually be able to affect the battle and hold your objectives. This maybe is a good example is in Stormcast Eternals, where you have Liberators, which are just a unit with hammers and shields, and they make for good objective holders. But you also have the option of maybe using Judicators, which, while they don't have swords and shields, so they're not quite as tough, actually have ranged weapons so they can affect the battlefield whilst holding your objectives. This is an option you need to weigh up, and whether or not you need that extra damage going out of a unit holding an objective, or whether you're just quite happy to have that more survivable unit sitting on an objective. Screens, chaff, and objectives aren't necessary for every army, but they are things worth considering. Once again, especially if you've got maybe lower drops, all these things, and especially the first two, definitely come into consideration. The next things to consider sort of continue on our previous points on units, sort of jobs around the table, and there's no reason that these two things I'm about to mention can't also be the things we've already talked about. and that are hammer and anvils. So hammer and anvils are two particular types of troops you put down on the table. Hammers, as they suggest, are the ones you go and smash face with. These are your hard-hitting units that you put on the table that are out there to deal damage. Generally, you want at least 2 of these, sometimes more in an army, though some armies don't actually have any hammers at all, and it's not uncommon for that to happen. But definitely hammers are things that go out and deal lots of damage, hoping to remove your opponent's toys off the table. Hammers are one of the main reasons in the game that you will put chaff and screens into your own army, because otherwise they can just get through and mince your units that you don't want to get hit. Potentially even wiping out your own hammers with their hammers. Now, anvils are the exact opposite. Anvils are units that are not supposed to die. These are units that are going to sit there and take the punch. Anvils generally don't need screens or chaff to protect them, though they can add an extra layer of anvil goodness to your anvils and making them all the harder to kill. But in general, anvils are units that are supposed to be able to take a punch, and these are the units that generally you want paired up with your opponent's hammers, so that the hammers can't actually do damage to the rest of your force, because your anvil just sits there, takes the hammer on the chin, and they just start hitting and playing the game of, can the unstoppable force remove the immovable object? Both of these units are important for your army, and not every army though gets to have either or both of these. Generally, an army might have more hammers and be less anvils in it, or it might have more anvils and less hammers. Generally, it'll be an offensive or defensive army, or you could have a mixed force where you have lots of hammer and anvils tied together, or you could in fact have an army that has no hammers, no anvils, and requires just masses of body and say chaff or screens and stuff like that. Next up, we're going to talk about artifacts of power and their placement within your force. So artifacts of power are little items that you can give your characters that enable them to do extra things. They can be something like give them a better sword or give them a better suit of armor, etc. There are a whole bunch of different things, and every army has access to them. There's also a bunch of other things like artifacts of power that you can get for your army that upgrades particular models, normally characters and sometimes monsters and other things within your force. These can be in the form of either, as mentioned previously, artifacts of power. They could also be mount traits, which help your mounts of your heroes, or potentially hero mounts as well. There can be prayers and spells as well, and a whole host of other different things in between. Now, what these things do is they enable your character models to have a little bit of differentiation and do different things throughout the game. What's important with these is where they're placed in your force. Now, the first thing to consider is if you've got particular artifacts that are going to help you buff things, you're going to want that character to be able to be near the things being buffed. So you're generally going to want that thing to be able to be survivable and keep up with the unit it's doing. Now, keep up doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be fast, because it might be buffing a unit that is stationary. So if that unit is never going to move anywhere from, it doesn't actually need to be a fast unit. So it's rather better investing those points in time into a more survivable unit potentially. But then it might not need to be more survivable, that particular model you're putting an artifact, spell, etc. on, because it may already be survivable. So it's these things to consider when you're putting these artifacts on characters. Do they need it? Why are they having it? And what is this doing for my force? The thing with this is whether or not you start stacking all these things to make one super killy monster, etc. within your force, or do you try and place them out throughout their army? And the answer really is, well, both. It depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to make this beat stick monster that's going to go out, become a hammer and smash your opponent in the face, then you're going to want to try and get as many power-ups on that as possible. While rather, you might be playing an army that's got lots of units and you're wanting to spread out your buffs, and you've only got a few little heroes in your force that aren't all that survivable. Maybe it's better, in fact, to actually place your artifacts, your spells, your command traits, and all these other things throughout your army on different models, enabling you to keep more of your buffs alive for longer, because your opponent has to target lots of different models on the table. This is just something to consider, and your placement of these can become very important in how your army plays. Next, it's worth considering contingencies within your force. Now, when you've started picking these spells and these prayers particularly more than anything, is it a spell or prayer that you're needing to get off that's an essential part of your plan in your army, or something that's so good and so important that you need it to happen all the time? Is it worth considering taking an extra priest or wizard to continue to get that spell, or maybe there's some other situation where you can take this contingency as well, but is it worth considering another model just for the sake of contingency? In Warhammer Age of Sigmar, things can die, and losing those buffs can be important, or losing those debuffs even from your wizards and your priests, etc., or things that provide them, can be rather bad if you lose them, and they can actually swing the tide of battle quite significantly. So is it worth considering taking a contingency model, a model that is there just for the sake of if your main caster dies, you can still do that thing you want to do? Now, with this, it's also worth considering that maybe generally most wizards in the game, or most priests, generally have war scroll prayers and things they can do other than that spell. Generally, army spells that you take are on top of. So this means that the model can do its own thing for a while, but maybe it's only there really, it's doing its own other thing, but it's really only there in case your other wizard dies. But it's worth considering, can that other thing be something useful as well? So I've got this main spell going off, but can it also be something else? Can your contingencies provide to the battle before they needed to be contingency as well? It's just something worth considering. Contingencies are something I personally consider a lot, especially if I'm building an army around getting particular spells off. Now we're getting on to just the last couple of things, and this is something worth considering, and this should apply, you can use this to previously gauge everything I've previously said and whether or not it's important to you. This is the strengths and weaknesses of your army. What does your army do well? Is it a close combat army that does really well at hitting your opponent hard? This would mean it, has lots of hammers and generally goes off being offensive. Is that army that goes and be as offensive really low drops, meaning it doesn't need to have chaffs and screens? Or is it actually high drops and it needs chaffs and screens to enable it to go fight, stop it getting bogged down before it can go do what it wants to do? Strengths and weaknesses are very important to consider, and it's worth finding these out. And sometimes you're not going to find these out without playing a few games. But it's worth remembering that every loss gives you information on what you need to do in order to fix things. Sometimes it may just be playing a little bit different, shuffling some models around here and there and changing up your unit sizes. Other times it might be that you actually are missing pieces that maybe are integral to your army succeeding on the tabletop. So you may need to go get a new unit or something to fill in a gap that you hadn't previously seen. Strength and weaknesses just are important things to consider, and there will be armies that generally have challenges that you face that may be something that you might not be able to counter normally, so you may have to try and find some way around it, whether that's buying more chaff to throw at your opponent if they're a massive combat army and just can't deal with the amount of raw power they put out, etc. The last thing I really consider thinking about when I'm playing games of Warhammer Age of Sigmar is the meta. Now, when I'm saying the meta, I don't mean the online meta that everyone tells you that these things are always bad and this thing's horrible to play against, or this is the most broken army in the game at the moment. I mean your meta. So where do you play and what is your meta? Because your meta is going to be different than anywhere else in the world. You might not have anyone using the most powerful army in the game at the time, or you might have everyone using the most powerful army, so maybe your meta is considerable similar to, I guess, the online meta. But it's worth considering your local meta and what you need to do to play against the armies you're playing against. If you're playing against a lot of combat armies and you're a shooting army, maybe you need to consider your meta is telling you to go get more chaff and more screens to help protect your army, and maybe get some more movement into your army to enable your shooting troops to move around more. But this is all just stuff to consider. What armies do you play the most? What do your friends have? And not necessarily list tailor to beat them, but consider them in part of your thought process on, like, okay, my friends have Caradron Overlords, so they're a shooting army. What do I need to consider in my army list building that helps me not get shot off the table? Or maybe your friend has, say, Ossiarch Bone Reapers. Cool, they're a very defensive army that my opponent can bring back his troops. So do I need to consider having stuff that enables me to wipe things off the table so that he can't rebuild his units? Or do I need to get an army that's really quick so I can get on the objectives first and make him come to me, etc. It's just things to consider in your local meta and what you do. So lastly in this video, I just wanted to point you towards a site to help you remember all these things we've talked about. So AOS Reminders is a cool little fan-made website that gives you a reminder sheet of everything that's happening in your army. Everything we've talked about, you have a lot of things to consider when building your army, and the AOS reminders can help you remember all the things to do by putting out a document that tells you all the things you need to do in your beginning of turn, hero phase, charge phase, etc. It's a fantastic little website and will really help you learn the game well and start remembering all those important rules you always forget. Definitely go give AOS reminders a check out after this video. Thank you all for watching. I hope this video has been useful for anyone new getting into the game, just some things to consider. If I've missed any points you think are worth considering in the video, please leave them down in the comments so anyone new can also go find them and I can add them to the video at a later date as well. Thank you though for watching. Please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We're getting so close to 2.5 thousand followers now, which is awesome. And if you'd like to come chat with me more and other members of our Fire community, you can do so by going on the link in the video's description down below to our Discord server. Lastly, while you're on YouTube, please do go check out my featured channel section, which features a bunch of other fantastic Warhammer Age of Sigmar content creators putting out a bunch of content ranging from battle reports, tactical analysis, and lore videos and more besides. Lastly though, I want to give a shout out to everyone who supports the channel financially. Thanks you to James, AJC, JC, Christian Weir, Philip Ward, Soren, Kenny Lowe, Alderin Shot First, Chaos Spawn, and James Crowder. Thank you all so much for your support. And if you'd like to help support the channel like these fine people do, you can do so by following one of the many links down in the videos below to either Ko-fi, Patreon, or YouTube members. Thank you all for watching once again. Don't forget to like and subscribe once more. Stay safe everyone, stay well, and most of all, keep fighting that war against the grey. Ciao for now.